Hello everyone. Our next video lecture will be on Islam and some of the basic tenets of Islam. But before we get into those early histories, let's cover a bit of vocabulary. I want to make sure we're using the proper terminology when speaking about the religion Islam so we don't make any mistakes. I hear people use words incorrectly all the time when talking about this religion and their people, and I don't want you to sound uneducated. So when speaking about the religion is called Islam, but the people, the practitioners, are Muslim, right? We're not going to call them Islams or Mohammeds or other things that I've heard. The people are Muslim. As an adjective, Muslim and Islamic can be used interchangeably. So you can say Muslim art or Islamic art, Muslim culture or Islamic culture, all that is fine. And I do not want us to conflate religion with ethnicity. Okay, so I will not accept for you to call Muslims Arabs, right? Many Arabs are Muslim, but not all Muslims are Arab. In fact, the largest populations of Muslims reside in South and Southeast Asia, right? In Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and other parts of Southeast Asia, notably Indonesia, has a huge population of Muslims. So the majority of Muslims are actually Asian, all right? So let's be careful of that and not to conflate all these things. The other charge I'm going to levy right now is, as we go forward, to make sure as we study Islam, especially as it grows into a political entity, which it does very quickly, we need to determine when actions arise from the religion or do they come from the culture that preceded it. Islam is a baby religion, right? It's only coming about around the year 600. And so at this point, cultures are deeply embedded throughout the world. Practices are now thousands of years old, and it's going to be hard to shake some of those practices. So when we look at things, such as some of the negative stereotypes that come from Islam, whether it's treatment of women, whether it's the concept or this false belief that Islam means war, that's not fair, number one, because when you read the Quran, you see almost anything but that stuff. But many of the earliest cultures that embraced it were either embroiled in war or were already deeply patriarchal or something like that. So we need to really look deeply and to determine what is coming from Islam and what's coming from the culture that was already there. And also what's coming from the politicians that embrace this religion and use it and might twist it a little bit. So let's just be very careful because I don't want us to conflate all these things and be unfair. All right, so the early history. Islam begins with the revelation of Muhammad, and Islam, to start, translates to submission, specifically submission to the will of Allah, right, to give in to the will of God. And Muhammad was born in Mecca in 570 CE. And it's important to note that he, was born in Saudi Arabia because he's born during a time when there was no centralized power. Saudi Arabia, as we'll see, actually I'll show you now, was broken up into many principalities. So in this kind of very strange map, we see many of the ruling families that had their own little principalities scattered throughout the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, or the Arabian Peninsula. And so all of these families functioned pretty similarly as Mesopotamia did, in that they were polytheistic and many of them had their own patron gods that very much were used to prop up the rule of these princes or these kings or whatnot. And so just like we've seen in Mesopotamia and even parts of Rome, right, if you refuse to pay taxes to build a temple, if you refuse to work for the good of something like that, you're going to get in trouble. And so Christians and Jews who have already been in this region will be persecuted because of that. And we'll see that when Islam comes to the scene and grows very quickly, many of the wars that break out are because this religion could undermine the way that these princes and kings use religion to prop up their power. Right, so back to the story of Muhammad. Born in Mecca, he has a rough childhood. He's orphaned at a young age. And he begins to live with his uncle, who was a fairly wealthy merchant. And this is also important because due to his background, due to the fact that he was already traveling about and mixing with some elites, we'll see some of the earliest converts to Islam are people of power. And also, it definitely appealed to the poor as it's a universal salvation religion that will, express the importance of the equality of all souls. But having some rich early converts will also give it a unique history. It's also important to note that he marries Khadijah as his first wife. He does take 4 wives, thus, polygamy is technically allowed under Islam because Muslims follow the example of Muhammad. And Khadijah is important because it's his relationship with her where we start to see this profound respect towards women. Khadijah was older than he was. She helped him very much in his life. He really respected her. And she was his first convert. And so she's seen as a pious example to all Muslims and definitely towards women. And so, as I said, Muhammad, in this kind of polytheistic culture, one day receives a visit from the angel Gabriel. This is important because this angel is also the same angel that has delivered messages in other Judeo-Christian stories. Most notably, this is the angel that came to Mary to announce that she would give birth to Jesus. So we're seeing all these connections between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Remember, they're all Abrahamic faiths. When Angel Gabriel comes to Muhammad, he begins to reveal the word of God to Muhammad, and this makes Muhammad a prophet. Many believe the final prophet. And those words, the recitations of God or Allah, eventually turn into the Quran, which is the holiest book of Islam. We looked at that. So very quickly, as Muhammad begins to preach and begins to get converts, and as I said, some of those converts that he receives are actually very notable ones. We'll see some similarities between the growth of Islam and the Protestant Reformation that we'll study later, in that some people will convert to the religion not necessarily out of faith, but out of political opportunity. Seeing that by embracing this religion, they can rebel against the other powers. And so some will do this, and this does create war within Saudi Arabia. And so as Muhammad begins to preach, he'll be attacked. Because of this, he poses such a threat that he and his earliest followers are forced to flee to Medina, which becomes known as the city of the Prophet. The stay in Medina is very important because it's here where we begin to really solidify what will become Muslim culture or the tenets of Islam, specifically what are known as the 5 pillars of Islam, the expectations that all Muslims complete in their lifetime or sometimes on a daily basis. So after a period of time, after they've gathered some resources, Muhammad returns to Mecca to recapture it, and this, is a warlike event. The belief that Mecca is the holiest place for Muslims, is this is where he received the word of God. And also, I believed it important to banish all forms of polytheism, or to smash all these idols, stuff like that. In waging these wars, we see the wars of Islam. We see that Muslims take over Mecca once and for all, and a real establishment of the culture. This is an image looking at the earliest Muslims coming and raiding what will later be known as the Great Mosque or the Kaaba, and they're destroying all these idols, as you can see right there, right? Because that is not okay in Muslim practice, and you must embrace monotheism. And so this is the extent of the spread of Islam. We'll deal with this in a separate manner. But if we look, Islam spreads so quickly. Christianity isn't legal for the first 300 years, so that limits its spread. And even after that, it's a relatively slow expansion compared to Islam. In this darker salmon, I don't know what you call it, we can see during Muhammad's lifetime how far it spreads within Saudi Arabia. In the orange, we see by 661, so really just 40 years, that it expands through most of the Middle East. And in the purple, we see how far it goes. It crosses the Mediterranean, goes to Spain, reaches towards India. I mean, this is a really quick spread. Some of this is via military campaigns. And then once we hit around 750, we see those types of campaigns totally end, and yet the religion spreads even further, right? So we'll get into the reasons why. But let's talk about the Islamic Schism right now, because Islam is broken up into 2 major sects. And from there, there's great variation. But the split of Islam comes very soon after the birth of Islam. So Muhammad dies in 632, and there's great controversy over who will succeed Muhammad as the leader of the faith, who will be what's called the Caliph, or the successor to Muhammad, the deputy of Islam, because very quickly Islam is not simply a faith, right, but has political importance, right? It's seen as like a state. And so we need a leader. The first three successors, or first three caliphs, were related to Muhammad by law. But the fourth caliph, Ali, was a blood relative of Muhammad. He was cousin, also a son-in-law, as you know that was happening back then, of the Hashemite family. And there was great controversy over Ali. Some were afraid that this would establish a dynasty and that no other Muslims would ever have a shot at leading the caliphates. Others truly just believed that Ali was not fit to lead. But regardless, this leads to a split in the Islamic community. Ali is assassinated, Ali's sons are assassinated, and then those who were against the reign of Ali become known as the Sunni, or the traditionalists. They assume all power of the Islamic community and establish what's known as the Umayyad Empire. And we'll study the Umayyads specifically later, but they're the ones who wage a great deal of war. As an empire, I'd say they actually were not very Muslim. They were very, how should I say this, ill-behaved. A lot of spending. There was also issues in terms of actually adhering to the doctrine. And as I said, we'll get into that stuff later. But what this signifies is the split in Islam, right? The schism. And it's almost purely over leadership, not necessarily over doctrine. And so our two sides, the Sunni and Shia. The Sunni are known as our traditionalists or our Orthodox Muslims. Ultimately, what this all boils down to is leadership, and they simply believe that the caliph should be elected by the Muslim community, and that they validated the Umayyad Empire, and that this is most Muslims today, right? Over about 90% of Muslims today are a form of Sunni Muslim. It should be noted that Sunni and the Shia otherwise really believe in most of the same things. But what begins a split in terms of leadership does lead to some cultural changes. The Shia, and we can see this spelled as Shiite as well, S-H-I-I-T-E, varieties in spelling. It's known as the party of Ali because of their support of Ali. They believed the only descendants of Muhammad could be caliph, right? That it was kind of divinely connected there, and that Ali was the only valid caliph. And they are a minority of Muslims, about 10%, most of them centered in Iran, and that's for a political reason that we'll study in the early modern period. But what's interesting is that culturally, we do see a shift in Shia Islam, and then there's this special emphasis on honoring the martyrdom of Ali and his sons and all those that were killed in the Umayyad Wars. And so we actually see kind of a little bit more mysticism in Shia Islam. Down here, this kind of bloody picture, we are looking at Shia adherents acknowledging the martyrdom, or the day that celebrates or honors the martyrdom of Ali. And what they're doing is like taking these kind of like sharp objects and they're whipping themselves, right? They're flagellating themselves and shedding blood in honor of that. There's an expectation that Shias go and pay and do pilgrimages to the tombs of some of the martyrs, such as the tomb of Ali, seen up here. So it's definitely a little more ritualistic than the Sunnis are, I would say. And even though, for the most part, Sunni and Shia will exist in peace for a long stretch of time, we of course know now, if you pay any attention to the news, that sectarian violence has grown. And it's often because of the kind of political twists that leaders have put on these religions to drive populations apart. But ultimately, their biggest disagreement is over leadership. A couple other concepts I'd like to go over as we will revisit them throughout the year includes jihad. So the concept of jihad, I'm sure we hear this in the news all the time. But this is, I think, a very misunderstood concept, especially by anyone extremists themselves. Jihad means to struggle. What it truly means is a struggle in order to maintain your faith. It does not mean holy war. That is a total misinterpretation of early Islamic text. And actually stole this image from like a Quranic school for kids. And so this is, what is taught. And if you read sections of the Quran and parts of the Hadith, so the Hadith can be problematic, as we'll see. This is what's expected from Jihad, right? So it's a struggle to refrain from doing wrong, right? It's a real struggle conscious. It's a struggle to, get rid of Satan. It's a struggle to always stay on top of your studies and learn your Quran and be a good person. It's a struggle to do the right thing and save people, and to get people to be open to Islam. You must struggle against oppression and stuff like that. What it's really meant to be is a defense. Jihad was never meant to be an offense. And yet, we'll see how in different points of history, people misinterpret or take things out of context in order to justify religious violence. In other terms that we should know, of course, is the Quran, the holy book of God. And this is considered the infallible word of God, right? So this is unquestionable. It's written in poetic verse because originally it was purely kind of orally transmitted, and also traditionally written in Arabic. It was kind of a rule that could only be written in Arabic for a long time, and then eventually they changed things up, and we see it translated in multiple vernacular languages. The Hadith is another set of holy books, or what I kind of call the secondary source of Islam. It's a collection of stories of notable lives of Muslims. It's a collection of stories and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad and other early notable Muslims. So the idea is that you were to study that if you are looking for advice on how to be a good Muslim, if you're looking for how to deal with some particular situations. This is a fallible source. It's open to great interpretation. And we'll see that this is sometimes where things can get a little difficult, maybe where sometimes people take things out of context, as people do in all faiths. But this is considered not necessarily the word of God, but the examples of other Muslims. Sharia law is another term I want us to know, and this is the belief in that Muslims have a specific set of laws that tie back to the Quran and the Hadith, and that is emphasized in some cultures more than others. Okay, so we also need to talk about the 5 pillars of Islam. The 5 pillars of Islam are the expectations of all Muslims, that you need to do some of these things all of the time, or once during the year, or at least once in your life, and that completing all of these things solidifies your faith. The first pillar of Islam is the Shahadah, which is the creed, or the declaration of faith. And this is really the only thing you need to do to convert to Islam. It is very easy to convert to Islam, which is another reason why it spread so quickly. But professing the Shahadah, preferably in Arabic, but I guess you can say in any language, is how you convert. And all it simply is there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. And what this does is emphasizes a belief in monotheism. It's really important to note the section where it says Muhammad is his messenger or Muhammad is the prophet, because we are not to worship Muhammad. We are to honor him as the final prophet, but do not worship, which is also why we don't show the figure of Muhammad in art, so as to not worship him. It's important to note that Allah is simply an Arabic word for God. Muslims acknowledge the same God as Jews and Christians, and Muslims embrace all other previous prophets as valid. Every prophet from Abraham to Moses and Noah and Jesus, right? Jesus is considered a prophet. He is an example to be followed. Muslims simply believe that he is not the Son of God. Okay, so this is very important, and all that one needs to do in order to convert. Salat, or prayer, is also an important pillar that must be practiced daily. So it's supposed to be 5 times a day. If you live in a Muslim community, you will know that it is time to pray, because there will be a call to prayer coming from a local mosque. When we get into art, we'll see that's why there's often minarets or other features, because originally, before microphones, The person doing the call to prayer would have to stand in a particular place and really belt it out so everyone would hear. And then you were to stop and either roll out a prayer rug, or maybe you'll go to mosque and pray. And praying isn't just kind of sitting and folding your hands and praying. It's a very physical act. I stole all this Quranic school imagery here. So there's a little boy showing the best way to pray. And you pray at certain times of the day in terms of like early morning, midday, kind of early afternoon, at night, etc. So, and you're supposed to be facing Mecca. The point of this, not only because this is where God, revealed the word to Muhammad, but also it's an affirmation of community, right? That all Muslims are coming together 5 times a day, stopping whatever else they're doing, and stopping to acknowledge their faith, a check-in with God, so that if we check in with God all the time, the rest of our day will be affected by that faith, right? We'll always be thinking about our faith and hopefully acting in a good way. And the thought of everyone doing it at the same time really affirms the community, brings everyone together. It's also important to perform ablutions before prayer, where you need to clean yourself. So you must clean your hands, your feet, and your face, because you must be clean before God. And so many mosques have kind of these wash stations or fountains out in front, so that you're nice and clean before you do this for God. Zakat is another one of our pillars. Zakat is the practice of almsgiving. This is a very important thing that began in Medina, because after all of these wars were waged, some people were left with nothing, some people started with nothing. But here as a community, or in Medina as a community, they realized the importance of supporting each other. And so they began the practice of almsgiving. The idea is that so long as you have money, and the thing about Islam is it's very open to the idea that you may not be able to contribute in the ways that everyone else can. So, for example, for prayer, for salah, if you're ill, you don't have to pray, right? Like, God understands. For almsgiving, if you have the money, you should give 2.5% of your salary or more to charity, to the community. So you can give it to schools or mosques, other charity. You can give it to a neighbor who really needs it, but it should be about that much money. But of course, there's wiggle room. So if you're very poor, you have to simply give your time. There's a passage somewhere in the Quran where, or maybe it's Hadith, where the Prophet said you only have to smile, right, if that's all that you have. So there's an understanding that not all people might have the money to do so, but considering how many rich people converted originally, it makes sense that they kind of built this in and said, hey, if you're wealthy, you need to give something to your community so that we can all be supported. So this is a tenet of Islam. Sawm, or fasting during Ramadan, is also a tenet of Islam, or a pillar of Islam. And Ramadan is a holy month that celebrates Muhammad's revelation. It does function on the Muslim calendar, which is a lunar calendar. So this means that Ramadan can shift in seasons. For the last few years, it's been in the summer. I remember times when it was in the winter. So you fast from sun up to sundown. And it's more than just that, right? If you are truly pious, you are not only just fasting from food, you're actually not supposed to drink any water. If you smoke or anything like that, you're not supposed to smoke. And the idea is that you give this up so that, number one, you recognize what it's like to live without, right? So you have empathy for the poor. But also, if you're not eating all day, it allows you this time to kind of reflect. And it's more than just not eating. Ramadan is supposed to be a time where you particularly focus on your religion. Again, a little image from Quranic schools that show you what you're supposed to do. So number one here, if you can see, you wake shortly before dawn and you have a big breakfast. So when I travel to Turkey, I'm sure if anyone else has traveled to a Muslim country, people are up very early in marketplaces or having picnics, before dawn. And they're really kind of stuffing themselves so they can get through their day. And then you need to pray, and you should be practicing a lot of good deeds during Ramadan, and you try to be very peaceful. And then at the end of the day, you come together and break the fast. And I have to say, I found this to be a really lovely holiday when I was in Turkey, because the idea isn't about like gift giving and craziness or whatever. It's really about community and watching families and friends get together in these parks or in restaurants every night. It was really very sweet. Brings the community together, acknowledges Muhammad. I also liked this kind of happy Ramadan Burger King image, or not commercial, we call this ad down here, of a burger bit into a crescent moon, or the symbol of Islam. Thought that was funny. The Hajj is the last of the pillars of Islam, and that is the pilgrimage to Mecca. That, if possible, again, right, there's an understanding that you might be too poor or too ill to do this in your life, but if possible, you should go on the pilgrimage to Mecca. And here we see in a couple parts of that. Obviously, the reason for this is that Mecca is the birthplace of Islam. Centered around all of this is the Kaaba, which was originally a pagan symbol that Muhammad and the Muslims took back. Some believe that this is where Abraham also received the word of God, which starts this tradition of monotheism. And there are multiple phases to the pilgrimage. And while you can go to Mecca at any time, you can go to the Great Mosque to pray and to acknowledge your faith, there is 1 week as the holiest, and that is the true pilgrimage where everybody goes. And so when you go, there are multiple phases. One of the most famous is when everyone comes together and walks around the Kaaba 7 times. If you can get close to the Kaaba and you can touch it, as you can see in this bottom picture, that's particularly like a special blessing. A really interesting detail, I think, is that the Kaaba is always draped in this shroud that is woven, preferably by virgins, which I find to be kind of medieval and interesting. If you can touch it, that's awesome, but most people probably can't get close to it because it's a very crowded event. It is encouraged that all people wear white on the pilgrimage, because what that does is wipes away all of our differentiation. If we're all wearing the same thing, we can't tell who is rich and who is poor, who's advantaged or disadvantaged. Right? It's all about equality. When I went to Turkey, I saw some cool things. Over here, on the left-hand side is a certificate that someone received to prove that they went on their Hajj. On this side, it's actually a compass, which shows where Mecca is, so you can pray in that direction. And the imagery of it is all about going on the Hajj, all these prayers and artist rendition of the Great Mosque. And this is what the Hajj looks like. So many people now, millions are descending upon Mecca in order to go on the Hajj. So this is a very crowded event. Only Muslims are allowed in Mecca during the holiest week. So you can see some people never really get close enough to the Kaaba now because it's such a crowded event. Yet another view of looking at this. I found this to be interesting. This is looking at the true expansion of Islam, and how many people are now going on the Hajj. Looking back in 1920, there was maybe close to 60,000 people going on Hajj, going on the pilgrimage. And now if we look at today, in 2014, it's like 1.4 million people that are coming from outside of Saudi Arabia, and about 700,000 local Saudi pilgrims. So we're looking in total over 2 million people going on the Hajj. This year it exceeded that, and you may have seen there was a pretty horrible tragedy, a stampede, because there are moments of this when the crowds get too thick. And so authorities are looking at how to make the Hajj safer. As I said, there are multiple phases to the Hajj. This is kind of looking at what it is. So you go to Mecca and you express your intention, you circle the Kaaba 7 times. You go on this journey. It's a pretty taxing thing. One of the most difficult parts, and this is where the recent tragedy happened, is the Muzdalifa, in which they reenact a moment in which Muhammad was tempted by the devil, as the devil does, and he collected stones, right, and threw stones at the devil to banish him. And that's what pilgrims do. They grab stones, or they have stones with them, and they throw them at this rock where it's believed that the devil had appeared. But in recent years, and definitely in the most recent Hajj, there's been stampeding and I mean a lot of safety issues because of how many people are going on Hajj now. So this has been a problem in recent years, so hopefully something to correct. But if at any point in someone's life they're able to do this, this completes their faith going on the Hajj. And so that's where we'll end this look. Our next lesson will look at the spread of Islam. All right, so there you go.